Okay, so we're recording now. So we'll give you a little bit of an overview of DSW before we start. For those of you who haven't worked with us before or are new to working with us. So we are an endpoint assessment organisation, been assessing since EPA was first kind of created and conceived. So we started off primarily actually in the financial services and banking sector. So as an organisation, we established in 1999, working with those big banks and insurance firms, etc., delivering L&D solutions really. And then when the apprenticeship reforms came about and endpoint assessment was born, that was a natural space for us to move into. So we continue to work and support those clients, but we've massively branched out due to the success we've had with our financial services portfolio and the great relationships we've got with our clients. We've now really broadened that portfolio of EPA products. So we have 36 standards that we're approved to assess now, and housing level 3 is the latest one that we've added to that portfolio. And we do have housing level 2 and level 4 under development as well. So keep an eye out, and we'll be making an announcement soon about when those are coming. We've got a very large bank of assessors. I think because we've got that background in resourcing and providing L&D expertise into employers, we've got a huge bank of 850 associates at our disposal, and of them, 250 are qualified assessors. So it means that we can really scale up and, you know, be agile when we need to, which is a real strength of ours. So adding to the number of training provider and employer clients that we work with on almost a daily basis. So currently working with over 120 training providers, delivering EPA on behalf of over 3,000 employers. So you've got a real breadth there. And it's been really exciting few years actually since I joined the company, and the next few years ahead are looking even more exciting. So a bit about me. So my background is in apprenticeships and in awarding and qualification design. So I've done that for probably about 16 years now. And since the apprenticeship reforms in particular, apprenticeships in EPA have become my area of specialism. So I have headed up endpoint assessment organisations for different bodies in the sector. Been at DSW for 3 years now, and we're building a really exciting team and an exciting proposition. So really looking forward to continuing to work with those of you who are already clients of ours. Really excited about the opportunity to work with any of you guys who are new to us. So Kayleigh, I will let you introduce yourself.
Morning everyone, so my name's Kayleigh. I'm currently a product owner with DSW. I've worked here for about 2 years now. I started off in the operations department, supporting training providers just day to day with administration and anything they needed. And then more recently I've moved over to become a product owner within the apprenticeships team, basically just helping to develop these products, make sure everything's running okay, and offer support to training providers.
Thanks, Kayleigh. And then over to Catharine.
Hi everybody, my name's Catharine Hinton and I'm an independent endpoint assessor working with DSW. Prior to working with DSW, I have been delivering the housing standards for about 4 years now. So I've got quite a good insight into the delivery side as well as the endpoint assessment side. I've got my own consultancy, delivering training and people management interventions for housing and other types of company. And I'm also, I was part of the Trailblazers groups for these apprenticeships. So I've kind of come full circle, having worked on developing and designing the new apprenticeships with employers. I'm now delivering and assessing them, so which is great. It's great to see them in action.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Catharine. So Catharine's going to kick us off this morning, actually. And so she's going to, from her kind of background and expertise, talk to us about why the Trailblazer Group was formed and developed the housing apprenticeships in the first place, and then a bit about who the apprenticeships aimed at as well. So really looking forward to hearing this, and then we'll move on to talking about some of the detail of the endpoint assessment plan afterwards.
Fantastic. So why housing apprenticeships? I mean, the housing has been a professional job for a long time, for over 100 years, and it involves a wide range of different parts of knowledge, different aspects of skills, different behaviours. And you've got a very complex set of legislation and regulation within which you have to work, particularly at level 3. And one of the things that is really that keeps people in the sector, working with housing, working with property companies, is that it is the most important aspects of somebody's life. Their home, their community, their ability to engage in communities, their abilities to look after a home that they're living in, and all of the benefits that come with being able to access somewhere stable to live, whether that is a private rented house for a short-term let, whether it's student accommodation, whether it's social housing, whether it's the local authority housing, whatever it is the most important aspect of somebody's life. And to be in that type of environment and to be working in that type of environment, definitely challenging, but it is also very rewarding. And the Trailblazer Group came about because there was this real need to establish that housing is a profession, and it has many different career pathways and many different ways to enter the profession. But there was no professional certification required to do this important job. So, for example, we could compare it to being a social worker, or we could look at surveying, and we could ask ourselves, why isn't there the same level of professional qualification as is required by those professions? So, on top of that, what we've seen over the last 5 years in particular is that since the introduction of university fees, many HND and degree programmes have been lost because they weren't cost effective for the organisation. For example, the cost of getting the loans out to do a degree in housing didn't really give you the entry point into a senior management role that would justify the cost. So we saw demand go down. So the Trailblazer Group was really keen that we developed a housing apprenticeship that would open up pathways across all the different careers in housing, and that would offer that professional certification via the different awarding bodies that are involved in the apprenticeship, such as the Chartered Institute of Housing. There are three levels at the moment: level 2, level 3, level 4, which gives a range of entry points into the sector, with level 2 being most popular for A-level college leavers. Level 3 is about the officer level, and level 4 is the manager entry point. What's also worth knowing about apprenticeships is that as a vocational or a vocationally related type of qualification, it fits with a number of people that work in the housing and the property environment who don't have formal qualifications. And particularly on the social housing side, you've got things like the employment of tenants and customers, and you've also got the social ethos of working in a type of company that is looking after somebody's life, their home and their community. So that led to the new Trailblazer Housing Apprenticeships, and there was a large group of employers behind that, and some of the aspects of the apprenticeship were quite challenging because we had to think about what property companies do? What do commercial housing officers do? Is it that different to what a social housing officer does? And if we look back over the last sort of 18 months, I think we've seen more of a convergence of all the different types of organisation than perhaps there had been before. So who is the apprenticeship aimed at? Well, anybody working in housing. So as I mentioned, social and market housing. It also gives you access to understanding different approaches to rents and for sales. And again, one of the themes that was particularly important in the Trailblazer group was that it was a passport across the industry. And particularly at level 3, the idea was that the knowledge, the skills and the behaviours that have been chosen are important across all aspects of the industry, and a stepping stone perhaps into another career such as surveying, or a stepping stone into care. If you understand some of the fundamental things around, for example, the tenancy agreement, contracts, the context of which you work, why safeguarding is important to you as any type of organisation, why GDPR is of concern. If you know that in one part of the organisation, you know it in whatever aspect you might go on to go into. And one of the things that we've seen already with lots of housing apprenticeships and apprentices is that they do go on to get jobs in the organisation that they have been trained in, which is a great accolade to them as students, but also it's about the apprenticeship being the right thing that's giving them the knowledge, the skills and the behaviours to succeed in a job interview. The other thing that the apprenticeship wanted to do was to raise standards in all of the sectors, and also to acknowledge that it is this really complicated set of skills, of knowledge and behaviours that somebody working in housing eventually it learns and it becomes second nature, but we don't necessarily acknowledge. So by providing this specialist but vocational route for different levels in the organisation, with access to different professional bodies, usually at student membership, what we're doing is we're helping to raise the standards in the industry, and we're giving people who are either new to housing or who have worked in housing for a while the opportunity to get a qualification that recognises the professionalism. Jake, could you move me on? Thank you. It is a challenging apprenticeship, and if you're new to delivering housing apprenticeship programs, you will find some aspects of it. I'm sure you'll be surprised at the breadth and depth that the housing apprenticeship covers when you compare it to something like customer service or business admin. For example, legislation is complex, it's ever changing. There's a real focus at the moment on building safety as a result of Grenfell, and that's leading to lots of new approaches, standards, pieces of legislation, new regulation and so forth. The Trailblazer though is that flexible that it doesn't say you must know this particular piece of legislation. It's based on the requirements of lots of different employers, and for some people the Care Act might be a very relevant piece of legislation if they're involved in care homes and property and housing related issues relating to care and support. But for another organisation, it might be the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985 that's the real important area. For everybody though, things like building safety, things like privacy and data protection are universal. But when you work as somebody, as a housing officer, or work as somebody in housing, you've got to know these things and work within this quite complicated set of guidelines. Could you move me on, please?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So having explained it is complicated, one of the things that DSW have done, which is absolutely fantastic, is they've produced a brilliant overview of the standard, and they've also drilled down into the knowledge, the skills and behaviours, and explained what's required by the apprentice to get them through the programme and through endpoint assessment. So I'm going to hand you back over to Jake, who's going to go over the standard in detail.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was really interesting and really insightful, actually. And I know when you come on to the next section of this that you're going to deliver, you're going to be looking at some of those individual KSB statements. And I'd be really interested to get your views around transferability, because I think there is that definite kind of, or a perception anyway, of a difference between the social and the private housing sector. But obviously it's a generic standard in its current form. It's not, okay, there's a pathway for social, a pathway for private. So I think because of that, the apprentices do need to demonstrate the breadth of that knowledge. But that was an interesting point that you made around, well, relevant to their role. I think that that's quite acceptable. So one of the documents that's in the toolkit is an amplification, which puts meat on the bones, if you like, for those individual descriptors as to, okay, here's some of the things that the apprentice might want to talk about when they're presenting their evidence. But thank you for that. Okay, so very, very high level overview of the standard then before we delve into the detail. So it's 18 months on programme. That's not something that we as an endpoint assessment organisation would police, provided the apprentice has been on programme for kind of a year and a day and they've fulfilled the other gateway requirements. We would approve them and they'd move into the EPA period. The maximum EPA duration is 6 months. I think in reality, I'd be very surprised if it took that long. I think a lot of apprentices will go through in a much shorter time period. So unusually with this standard, there are some specific pre-gateway knowledge requirements. And we'll talk about those in a bit more detail shortly. But in terms of the endpoint assessment itself, there are two assessment methods. So the first is a work-based project. And the second method is a presentation with a panel interview. And again, we'll dive a bit deeper into those shortly and explain how that works in practice. And the last thing to say, which Catherine mentioned, is that the standard is aligned to professional recognition for 3 professional bodies. So I think that's a real kind of selling point for apprentices and for employers, in fact, as well. Okay, so we've broken this down really into kind of what is assessed in terms of competency areas, KSBs, assessment criteria, and then we'll move on to how it's assessed in terms of the assessment methods that are deployed within the EPA. So in terms of what is assessed, so as a starting point, it's useful to have in mind the idea of these competency areas. So across the standard, there are 26 competency areas which are divided into those knowledge, skills and behaviours. So for example, one competency area is communication. Within each of those competency areas, there are a set number of individual assessment criteria. So each competency area will contain between 1 and 5 assessment criteria. And it's really when you're thinking about preparing the apprentice and when the apprentice is presenting their evidence and answering the questions, it's those assessment criteria that they should be focused on, because the assessor is going to be marking them specifically against those criteria. So if they know those inside out and they're very well prepared, they should have a good experience and a good outcome as well. So in total, there are 59 of those individual assessment criteria, and they are divided as follows. There are 22 knowledge criteria, 20 skills, and 17 behaviours. So that makes sense when we talk about that notion of transferability. So I think it's important that an apprentice can demonstrate that they have the breadth of knowledge within the occupation, that their apprenticeship certificate, when they're given it, is transferable. So indeed, if they've spent kind of 5 years working in a social housing, and then we give them the certificate and they're qualified, they can then move on and move into the private housing sector, and they've at least got that underpinning knowledge of how it works across the whole occupation. Whereas the skills are a lot narrower because they are kind of specific to that apprentice's role and the actual activities and duties that they have exposure to in their day-to-day role. So we always expect to see a heavier weighting towards the knowledge element. And all of the 59 assessment criteria must be met for the apprentice to pass their endpoint assessment overall. Okay, so I'm going to hand back to Catherine now, actually. So what we've done in this next section, we've listed the different knowledge competency areas and then the skills and then the behaviours. And I'd ask Catherine ahead of this session just to have a look through those and offer some of the insights she's got as somebody that helped develop the standard and as somebody that's been actively delivering it for a number of years, what some of her insights were, areas to be aware of, areas to focus on, and any kind of hints and tips, if you like. So back over to you, Catherine, if you don't mind.
No problem. Thanks, Jake. So here, the knowledge criteria, as Jake has said, this is probably going to be the most challenging aspect of the apprenticeship for many apprentices, especially those that don't have a great deal of formal education behind them. The one area that stands out is legislation and regulation. It is a difficult area. It's full of jargon. It's if we look at the legislation and regulation that applies to people working in housing, there's about 170 different acts and regulatory standards that somebody working in housing has to be aware of. Some of those 170 pieces of legislation. We typically focus on things like the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, because that sets out the real understanding of tenancy agreements in their modern form and the role of housing associations in particular. There's also a whole raft of legislation around the quality of homes that is very important that apprenticeships understand. So understanding the decent home standard and the housing health and safety rating system, which applies across the board for whatever type of accommodation somebody's renting. And it doesn't matter who they're renting it to, it is a key piece of regulation that everybody needs to be aware of. There's also things like houses in multiple occupation licensing. And as I mentioned earlier, a whole raft of things coming in are based on the Building Safety Bill and fire safety. The other thing that happens with legislation in housing is that it changes regularly. And things that you might start your apprenticeship with a certain set of legislation and regulation in mind to teach an apprentice. By the time they get to endpoint assessment, something else significant might have happened, such as the introduction of the housing white paper. We've got a planning white paper that's got some impact on housing strategy. So for apprentices to keep abreast of all of this changing regulation, knowing what the certain acts are called and what is their key area of influence is actually quite challenging. So it's something that needs quite a bit of thought and care into deciding what's going to be delivered. But again, the amplification document helps you to understand what makes a pass and what makes a distinction. And the great thing is that, again, it's about what's relevant to the individual apprentice in their current workplace. Organisation background information is about learning about the history of the organisation and understanding the vision and the values, and usually this is undertaken during an induction phase, that the organisation shares most of this detail with the apprentice during that phase. So that one's quite an easy one for apprenticeships to get to understand, because they've been through usually some sort of induction program, or they've been working in the organisation for some time and know this through exposure to the information. Assets and asset management is, again, recognising the fact that we are working with assets, that we're working with buildings as well as customers, which is the next knowledge area covered. And the criteria here are about understanding the asset and understanding the customer. So it's about understanding the types of property. Are there any unusual types of property, repairing, maintenance, and some of those links to legislation, things like gas safety checks and the building quality checks that need to take place. Customers, it's about knowing the customer base that's relevant to you, what their needs are, any special needs, how things like the Equality Act impact on your work, and so on. Now, context is often one of the most popular topics that learners enjoy finding out about, because it's about the history of housing and it's about situating housing and property management in its current environment, but looking back to say, why do we do things the way that we do? And maybe considering, why do we do things like this in the UK when a country like Germany does it differently? Range of services, again, this is often something that an apprentice that's been in the workplace a while understands, or if they're a new apprentice, it's often covered in the induction phase, and it's about recognising that it's not just about rent collection and rent arrears, but there are other services that organisations can offer to customers: house buying, leasehold, care and support services, access to money advice services, all sorts of things. Organisational policies, again, a bit like legislation and regulation, if we were to look at every single policy of an organisation, we would be looking at sometimes up to 50 or 60, up to 100 different policies. But fortunately, all we're looking for here is the key policies. So those key policies such as equality and diversity, data protection, safeguarding, rent and rent collection and rent arrears, repairs and how they're classified. They're some of the key policies. We're not necessarily needing to drill down into, oh, you know, as a level 3 apprentice, what's your understanding of the procurement policy for buildings over £100,000? Unless somebody's working in that environment, we wouldn't be expecting them to understand that in detail.
Thanks, Catherine. Just before we move on to the next slide, there's a question from Louise. So is there a list of legislation/regulation that needs to be covered as a minimum? So I think I'm right in saying, Catherine, that the amplifications document that's embedded in the toolkit then will list some examples of the types of legislation, and then we'll give a steer as to, okay, they must discuss a minimum of 3, for example. Yeah. And again, I think it's about what is relevant to that apprentice. If they're working in providing care and support, then something like GDPR and understanding safeguarding is going to be more important to that particular individual, whereas somebody that's working in, for example,
acting as a legal officer, dealing with rent arrears. For them, it will be the Landlord and Tenant Act and some of the acts relating to court action.
Brilliant. Thank you, Catherine. That's just such a good point, actually. So I think what might aid the apprentice is if they really spell that out in their portfolio or in their responses of, okay, these are the most relevant policies for me in my role, and then they go on to discuss them.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, next one.
Okay, so the skills that are assessed are not surprisingly focusing on some universal skills such as customer care, communication, and collaborative working. What's slightly different with the housing trailblazer apprenticeships is the acknowledgement that the conversations that we have with customers are often about their revolving around rights and responsibilities. Either we're talking to them about a breach of tenancy or their right to have their property repaired, or we're talking about them needing to move somewhere else. And again, it's recognizing that these are important conversations that need a skillful and tactful way of working. And that's what makes housing and property management different from, for example, the customer care required to work in Costa Coffee or to work in Quick Fit. It's a different environment. Information collection and sharing is pretty critical in housing. And again, what gets collected and shared is going to be relevant to, is going to be centered on what's relevant to that individual. We then start to go into, again, some general skills, influencing and negotiating, being able to influence customers to do something that they need to do in order to not be evicted, for example, or being able to influence and negotiate with a contractor regarding a pavement repair. Again, we're talking relatively low level, but it's about recognizing that we do have these skills and they can be honed and they can be polished. Similarly, things like problem solving and decision making, where one of the reasons people love working in housing is every day's different. Every customer brings you a unique set of circumstances. And as the officer that's working with them, you've got to help them solve their problems and make decisions about what to do on behalf of the company. Self-management, that's the basics, things like keeping your diary, getting things done on time, and tools and equipment, again, very much relevant to the role. For some people, their tools and equipment is their laptop and access to the internet and the company intranet. For somebody else, it might be a damp meter, or it might be using a camera, or working with boundaries of a property. So again, it's really about, again, building the skills that the individual needs, but recognizing that there's going to be some real need for tact and polish in some of these areas. What we need to do with the apprenticeship program is not just get the apprentice to talk about these skills in the abstract way, but to show that they have developed these skills, that they've got these skills. And that's where the manager or the mentor will be a really important ally, because they're the ones that are going to be observing and experiencing the apprentice with their skill set on a daily basis. So ready to move on unless there's any questions?
Just a question for me, Catherine, actually. So I think I'm just thinking about the assessment methods then that are deployed in this particular EPA. So we don't necessarily have an assessed portfolio as you might with others. So we've got the project, which is kind of ostensibly a report with some supporting evidence. Then you've got a kind of panel interview. So what's the best way, do you think, then for the apprentice to demonstrate to the assessor that they've got these skills using those particular formats?
So I think particularly with the project, I think one of the things that that's quite important is the project diary. Or reflection, and that's very much where we'll be able to see some of those skills coming across, such as self-management, the ability to reflect on, well, this didn't go quite as well because I hadn't done this, I hadn't put the appointment in people's diaries, or what. Being able to reflect and being able to describe what somebody's done will be important. But the manager, again, it's about recognizing that their role is about supporting the apprentice to develop these skills, as well as the training provider to perhaps provide some context and some and theory behind it.
Thank you very much.
Again, behaviours. Now, this is one of the interesting things with the apprenticeship, is there's a little bit of overlap. So you can see there customer care, teamwork, being responsive, being dependable. They overlap with quite a lot of the skills. And again, it's quite hard to demonstrate these, especially in a panel interview. How can I show that I am trustworthy in a panel interview? How can I show that I have independence and that I can also work in a team? So again, we need to sort of lean on the manager and their understanding of the apprentices' behaviours, develop those behaviours over the apprenticeship programme, and then using things like the project diary, a reflective look at the behaviours, perhaps as part of the project submission. Again, it's about thinking about how can I show this, not just talk about it. So what evidence can I put forward that shows that I was responsive and I was resilient in the face of bad news or something going wrong? Again, things like personal commitment, I think it would be useful there again to think about that personal commitment is actually about commitment to personal development. So including some sort of brief plan of, now having done this, what I hope to do with my project is this, and in order to do that I have identified these development areas for me. I can see that there is a question. As a tutor, would it be beneficial, recommended to carry out professional discussions with the apprentice while on programme and before Gateway? Absolutely. I think getting apprentices really understanding how to answer questions well is a key skill that really does show in the endpoint assessment. So when, for example, let's say the assessor picks on a question, tell us about a time when you were behaved as a role model in the workplace. That learner needs to be able to understand exactly how to answer that question in a way that demonstrates the criteria. So they need to understand what the criteria are underneath role model and form an answer that really showcases that they worked on behalf of their organisation. For example, in a neighbour nuisance case, and they had to represent the organisation at a mediation, meeting held by the local council, and as part of this they prepared this, they did this, they said that, and that's quite a skill. Absolutely getting apprentices used to giving full detailed answers is something that I would recommend practicing a few times as part of the program. If you've delivered old style apprenticeships in the past where you maybe did verbal assessments of the criteria, or you did an observation and asked somebody questions afterwards, it's sort of that kind of thing. It does become quite noticeable at endpoint assessment that if an apprentice just gives a short answer, yes, I did this, it stops them from the opportunity to get that distinction, because they're not really giving that full answer that showcases all of the criteria. Are there any other questions at the moment?
I would just echo what you said there, Catherine, about getting them prepared for that EPA experience of answering the questions. I think the combination of that and knowing those individual assessment criteria inside out just makes for such a good experience for the apprentice. There are some mock questions as well for the interview that are in the DSW toolkit, so that helps the apprentices to understand the format of the questions and kind of the depth of the responses that the assessors are looking for. And then another good tip, and I don't mean to teach anyone to suck eggs, but is to get the apprentices to sit those mock discussions, mock interviews with people that they don't know necessarily. So maybe somebody else's skills coach, because it's a whole different experience of trying to articulate that to somebody who you don't know. Not least of all because they don't have the context of having observed you in the workplace. So actually, is the apprentice given a really concise answer that gives enough information to the assessor for them to think, yeah, they've nailed it, they've understood it, and I'm confident that they do it.
I think another tip is to prep the apprentice by saying, assume that the endpoint assessor knows nothing about housing, and you're having to tell them.
Yeah. Super. Thanks for that, Catherine. So I will move on to the next section if there aren't any other questions, which will be, I believe, how is it assessed? Yeah. So now we're going to look at the different assessment methods that are deployed and talk a bit more about kind of the process, if you like. So just to recap, we've got two assessment methods. So there's the work-based project and there's a presentation panel interview. But there's this additional requirement that I mentioned at the start around the on-program assessment of knowledge. So in order to progress through Gateway and into the endpoint assessment period, the apprentice has to have completed one of three routes to demonstrate that they've got that underpinning knowledge. So the first is that they have achieved a recognised qualification. So a list of recognised qualifications is available in the DSW toolkit, and we would just require evidence that the apprentice had achieved that either through a copy certificate or a results slip from the awarding organisation. And the second option, if the apprentice isn't doing a qualification, is that they achieve an approved knowledge test. And again, this is something that's baked into the assessment plan, so it is a requirement. And the way that works is within the DSW toolkit, we have a specification. So if you're a training provider and you think, okay, we want to use the knowledge test route, we give a specification as, okay, your knowledge test needs to do the following things. It needs to cover the following content. And then we would pre-approve that test. So we wouldn't then individually mark the apprentices to make sure that they were competent. We would approve the test. And then as part of the gateway, you would tell us, okay, this apprentice has undertaken that test and they passed it. And we now believe they're ready for EPA. And then the third option is that they complete a portfolio of evidence. So as long as you can demonstrate that the apprentice has done one of those three things, then they are eligible to move through gateway and start their EPA. Okay, so first of all, I think it's useful if we talk about the assessment panel. And I do know from speaking to training providers and employers, not just on housing, but actually on a breadth of other standards, is that it can become a bit of a bottleneck actually when the line manager needs to be involved, because they're experts in the occupation, but not always experts in assessment. and it can delay things if we try to involve them too much or if we make it too laborious. So when we've mapped out the EPA process and built our toolkit, we've very much had that in mind. So we've made it as lean as we possibly can so that the line manager is contributing, and they're giving their opinion and they're giving their grading recommendations, but they're not filling out reams and reams of paperwork, because that can become a blocker and it can cause delays to the EPA and things like that. So the assessment panel itself, they do carry out an independent assessment of each of the assessment methods. And there's a discussion at the very end, which I'll talk about shortly, where the final grade's kind of discussed and agreed. But the panel's made up of the apprentice's line manager, the apprentice's skills coach, and the independent endpoint assessor who's appointed by DSW. Okay, in the event that the panel can't reach a consensus on the grade, the independent assessor will have kind of the holding vote, the deciding vote. And there are some documents within the DSW toolkit that just help to facilitate this and bring some clarity to the process. So the first is a guide for the panel members, which includes kind of roles and responsibilities. And I think that that's particularly useful for the line managers, because quite often the training providers and skills coaches experienced in the art of assessment and, you know, endpoint assessment, but employers less so. And the second is a declaration form. So the declaration form, what we decided not to do, we decided not to ask the line manager to individually mark and give comments and grades for each of the assessment criteria, because there are 59 of them, and like I say, that's likely to become a bit of a blocker towards getting them through. So what we've done instead is we have this declaration form that's embedded within the toolkit, which is signed by the line manager and the coach, whereby they declare that they understand the grading methodology. They believe that the apprentice has met the minimum requirement, but then they can also log any feedback. And I think it's really important that the line manager does do that, because when we talked previously about the skills and the behaviours, and okay, well, behaviours in particularly, how do you actually demonstrate those to an assessor in an interview? It's quite difficult, and in many ways they're kind of taking your word for it as the apprentice. Whereas within this declaration form, there is the opportunity there for the employer to say, well, actually, yeah, they have exhibited the following behaviours, and specificity is kind of key there as well. So similar to a witness testimony from a line manager, if they can talk specifically about an instance where they've seen the apprentice do something that validates the apprentice's own account. So I think it's really important that the line manager does fill that in. It is a requirement that they fill that in order for the assessment to take place, but it is an opportunity for them to really kind of big up the apprentice as well and justify why they're putting forward a particular grading recommendation. Okay, so the work-based project. So I've picked out a couple of lines from the assessment plan here because they're really important. The first is that it must have direct relevance to the role of the housing and property management role. So it shouldn't be kind of just a generic project or even a business as usual activity. It should be something that delivers real tangible return on investment, either to the apprentice's employer or to the tenants or the clients that they serve and provide to. And the second important quote there is that the apprentice must interact directly with tenants and colleagues. So it can't be kind of an internal introspective thing. It needs to be something where they are interacting with and they can provide evidence that they've interacted with tenants and colleagues within their business. So they are written into the assessment plan. So they are things that the apprentice must do. So I thought I would pick them out and just make that really clear. And when the actual thing that's assessed, if you like, is a project report, which will be supported with some extra kind of product evidence, if you like. And I know Catherine's going to give some examples shortly about the types of product evidence that the apprentice can use to supplement that report. But it's really a written report, which is almost a reflective account, really, which explains to the independent assessor, this is kind of what I did. These were the target objectives of it. These were the different stakeholders. This is how I managed it. Any issues that came up and how they were resolved, how they managed different risks and things like that as part of that project. There's the project diary, which again is mandatory because it's in the assessment plan, but it really helps to give that extra lens to the assessor. And in particular, when it comes to things like self-reflection and when the apprentice thinks, okay, this is what I did, and actually could I have done that differently, the diary is really useful in that respect. And the final document is the project referencing table. So that's in the DSW toolkit, and that's used by apprentices to record where they've met each of those individual assessment criteria by referencing, say, the page number within the project report, by referencing any of that additional support and evidence that we put in there. Okay, so the apprentice may actually begin their project itself while they're on program, provided it's within the last 6 months of their own program, so 6 months before Gateway. It was very important that the apprentice doesn't start writing up that project report until after they've gone through Gateway and that Gateway has been approved by the DSW team. Okay, so it's the project report is the actual kind of accessible output, if you like. So it's really important that that isn't started until after Gateway has been approved. Okay, so a bit more on the project. So what we recommend is that the apprentice tries to, within their project report and support and evidence, tries to actually demonstrate all 59 of the assessment criteria. Because if they do that and they manage to do that, they're going to have a much better experience and a much better chance of success and in fact, a distinction when they come to the panel interview. However, in order to progress, they need to meet a minimum of 47 of those assessment criteria. And the reason we put that in is that we want them to be able to carry over an element into the interview. But what we don't want to do is to put them into the interview, which can be quite a stressful experience for people that are not used to that. And is also a timed kind of more pressurized assessment under controlled conditions. We think it's important that we don't load too many of those assessment criteria into there, because that puts a lot of stress and a lot of burden on the apprentice. So actually what's fair is to say, within your project, which you're completing over a period of time with support from your coach, with support from your line manager, you should aim to meet the majority of the assessment criteria within that project. So provided they meet 47 or more, they will progress. The maximum word count, and this is something we're going to monitor over the course of the next few months, is 7,500, and we've based that really on conversations that we've had with clients, ATPs, around apprentices on this standard currently and how long their project reports typically are. We haven't set a minimum currently because some people have told us 4,500 is fine, some have said 7,500. So we set a maximum of 7,500 for now, but we will continue to review that. It must be supported with the product evidence, which Catherine's going to talk about shortly. And we do provide a template for that diary within the DSW toolkit. So I'd strongly recommend that the apprentices use that. And the stuff that's in the diary isn't just supplementary actually to the project report. It can contribute towards the achievement of those assessment criteria. So within the diary, the apprentice has the opportunity of mapping in any of the criteria that they think they've actually demonstrated through the diary. And again, that's where a lot of those behaviors are going to come in, where they can evidence that through the diary, and actually that can be corroborated through their line manager as part of their feedback and part of the discussion at the end. I'm just conscious of time, so apologies if I whiz through this, but do fire through any questions that come through at the end. And there's a lot of guidance in the DSW toolkit, and there's a project guide in there that's actually very robust, so it gives the apprentice some recommendations as to the types of things that might constitute a project, might be suitable for a project, but also guidance on how to write their project up, how to present their evidence, how to map it effectively and things like that. So strongly recommend that they use that. And the final assessment decision for the project will be communicated to the training provider within 5 working days of that project report being submitted for assessment. Okay. So over to Catherine to give some examples of the typical types of projects we'd expect to see at this level.
Okay, I'm just, Jake, I've just seen there's a question. I'm surprised that the employer and the tutor form part of the decision, as I thought the whole purpose of the government changes to move to standards was that the EPA was independent of us and the employer. This is something that is within the housing assessment plan, and the wording is along the lines of that the final assessment is a consultative approach, and it's about the training provider and the employer giving some insights into the assessment of the standard, and there being essentially, as I say, building a consensus, building and outlining anything that the EPA should know in order to deliver the most accurate and the most valid judgment. Those then have to be moderated and go through a quality assurance process at DSW. So it's a different approach to some other endpoint assessment organisations which are doing things slightly differently. So I hope that answers the question. Typical level 3 projects.
Sorry, Catherine,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. There was just a couple of other questions on there, so I'll just answer those before we move on.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. Relevant to what I just said. Yeah. So on the kind of the contribution of the line manager and the coach as well. So it does, I believe, say in the assessment plan that all of the panel members will grade each of the components, but we do reserve the right that ultimately the endpoint assessor makes the decision, because you're quite right that they are independent and that it is their final decision. But I think the value that the line manager and the coach bring in, particularly at the end of the process, because they're not involved in asking any of the questions as part of the panel interview, but what they can do is the apprentice leaves at the end, and then there's 20 minutes left for a discussion. So actually that's their chance to provide any additional context that might be organisation specific, for example, and give any kind of additional rationale as to why, if they disagree with the assessor, why that is. So the assessor can take that on board. Doesn't necessarily kind of influence their decision, but it does provide that additional context that might be useful. And just a couple of other questions that were on there. So Jane had a question. Can I clarify a point? For knowledge, are you saying if they produced a portfolio of evidence throughout, which they must as part of the assessment plan, there was no need to provide prove knowledge and no test? So that's right. If they've done the portfolio as part of their own program, then they don't need to do either the knowledge test or the qualification. We don't need the portfolio to be submitted to ourselves. I believe that's just, and correct me, Kayleigh, if I'm wrong, it's a declaration at Gateway to say that that's been done.
Yeah, that's right. We will just need confirmation that they have completed one of those Gateway knowledge components. Yeah.
So it's kind of just like the what we have as standard with the EPA is the declaration from the employer to say, yes, okay, we think we've done an assessment, we think this person's competent and ready to go through Gateway. It's that, but it's a bit more of a detailed, bit more of a robust process for the employer and the training provider, I guess. And just before we move on, so Jane had another question. Can you go over the project part again? I'm a little confused about not completing the report at the same time as the diary. Yeah, so the reason for that is, so the diary, absolutely, they would complete the diary at the same time as they're doing the project, because it would be completely nonsensical for them not to, because then otherwise they're going to be kind of reflecting on stuff that they did potentially a long time ago. But the project report, the reason that they can't start writing their project report until after they've gone through Gateway is that in terms to in order to preserve the integrity of it being an endpoint assessment, they should be doing the actual assessed activity after they've gone through Gateway, if that makes sense. So we want to be flexible on the project, because we do get feedback a lot from employers to say, well, actually trying to issue on a project in post Gateway is just not workable for us as a business. It becomes arbitrary, it undermines the value in the apprenticeship, and actually you end up with poor quality projects that have been designed purely for EPA. So we do afford that flexibility for them to start the project in the latter parts of their own program phase, but they shouldn't write up that report until after they've gone through the Gateway stage. Sorry, Catherine, back to you.
No problem. So typical level 3 projects. They should include communication with customers and colleagues in some way or form. They are intended to stretch and challenge the learner. So again, as a training provider, it's about thinking about what could stretch or challenge this learner and cause them to develop new knowledge, new skills, new behaviours. And as Jake has said, it needs to be done independently, but that doesn't mean that you can't support the apprentice either as the training provider or the employer. We would expect you to be keeping them focused on their project and giving them practical advice, but you can't do the project for them. So, Jake, could you move on? Brilliant, thank you. So, sorts of examples, and these are projects which I've been working with apprentices on relatively recently. For example, researching into drug and alcohol services for tenants and production of a toolkit for housing officers that was based on good practice relating to how do you handle that complex situation that somebody is using drugs and alcohol, which technically would be a breach of tenancy in the case of drugs, but you still want to support and help that customer. Another project which worked out really well was looking into how a new role would differ from a previous role and how that would impact on somebody's work in terms of understanding new terms, what the relevant policies are, any frequently asked questions, and presentations outlining the changes that were going to be required, and then embedding that within a team. Impact of COVID-19, of course, that's been a massively popular topic on a range of different areas, but particularly around tenancy sustainment and management of cases where tenants are in high levels of arrears, researching that, looking at good practice, and then sharing that information with the workplace. Impact of COVID-19 and lockdown, particularly on provision of tenancy support services. I've also had care services. I've also had repair services. So again, lots of rich learning in that area. Research into the most efficient way to plan long-term asset management in areas that are more remote and scattered. Research into impact of new customer communications platforms on customer satisfaction. Again, these are just some examples of the range and the breadth of the projects that could come through. In terms of the supporting evidence, in addition to the project report, the apprentice can submit things such as the project diary. And as I mentioned, that shows some of the areas of the skills and the behaviours. Reflective journal that can cover any significant developments and bring to life the learning journey that apprentice has gone through. Appendices can show information collection and sharing. Letters and emails can demonstrate written communication. Anything completed as part of the project. SWOT analysis, personal development plans, notes from meetings with managers, with mentors, and so forth. I can see there's a couple of questions. Read the project. Is it okay for a first draft to be completed at Gateway? I think that's a question for you, Jake.
Yes, I think naturally in delivering the project, the apprentice is going to have kind of extensive notes and things that they've taken as they've gone through. So they can absolutely do that. I think that the project report itself would need to be substantively different, I guess. So we wouldn't want them to kind of basically write the report, go through Gateway and then tweak a couple of words, but they can absolutely collect notes and things like that and then use them as the basis for their report. In actual fact, I think in reality, the project diary is probably going to end up being the framework on which to write the report, because that's going to have the detailed reflection on the stuff that they did when they did it.
Brilliant, thanks Jake. And from Karen, there still seems considerable emphasis on social housing rather than private sector. A few examples of private sector projects would be helpful. Absolutely. I mean, they're just examples from my experience, which is predominantly working with social housing providers, but I have got some examples. One of them is looking at rent setting and looking at market rent setting in a new area that an organisation was moving into, doing all the research into what rent should be charged with an estate agent that was moving into lettings. There's been revamping and revisiting an existing tenancy agreement and developing a handbook for customers so that anybody who was a customer of that particular letting agent had a very clear plain English version of the tenancy agreement, and also had a handbook of various things such as what repairs would be recharged, advice as to the local area, advice about what to do if, and a sort of frequently asked questions aspect. And I've also seen projects based around communication with customers. So again, newsletters for tenants, whether they're commercial or private rented or social. And I've also seen projects which have been more focused on asset management. So for example, looking at rationalising an area of asset in a large commercial employer. So I hope that gives you some ideas. Again, it's that's something that training providers and employers can work together with the apprentice on. And it's very much what I find is that the employer often has ideas that they have been just waiting for somebody to come along and say, I could do this project for you. And that works very well. A lot of employers often have things going on that the apprentice can do. Oh, Jake, you're on mute.
Yeah, classic. I'm just looking in the Q&A box there, and there's another comment from Jane where she's given an example of a project which I think looks really good. I don't know what your view is on that, Catherine.
Yeah. One of my learners completed a project on introducing video procedures for property inspections and checkouts, or for tenants to show maintenance issues. And that meant the development of new procedures and policy to ensure GDPR and quality was a very good project. Yeah, absolutely. Again, COVID's been quite an area of innovation as to actually how can we demonstrate and show customers what a property looks like without breaching lockdown, if they live 200 miles away. All of those things have led to things like the 360-degree video showcasing of a property, and again of maintenance issues, and it cuts down time for everybody. It's an absolutely brilliant sort of area to consider.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll move on to the next section. So we've talked there about the projects, types of projects, the type of support and evidence that the apprentices might put in there. So the second and final stage of the endpoint assessment then is the presentation and panel interview. Okay, so the interview and the presentation are delivered via online video conferencing. So typically it'd be WebEx or Zoom or Teams. We are quite flexible in that respect. I think our background in financial services has benefited us because Obviously, a lot of those clients in banking have very strict firewalls and stuff, so we are very flexible in terms of the types of platforms that we use. So if there's a platform of your choice that's not on that list, let us know and we'll be able to accommodate that. So the interview must take place in a controlled assessment environment. So we do provide guidance that's on our EPA Pro system and linked, I believe, in the toolkit around what that controlled environment looks like. But it's basically, you know, it's a safe environment, free from distractions, where the apprentice can't be disturbed or kind of aided. So the assessor will ask the apprentice to kind of move their camera around and just check that they're in an appropriate environment, and will check their ID, photographic ID at the beginning of the assessment. So to kick off, the apprentice will deliver a short presentation, and it's just a 5-minute overview of the project. And it's their opportunity to articulate any of those things that are perhaps trickier to get across in a written format, but it's also a real opportunity for the apprentice to demonstrate their enthusiasm and their kind of character as well before they begin that interview. So it's a 5-minute presentation on an overview of the project, any of the kind of activities and tasks undertaken, and then the outcomes of the project as well. Okay. So the apprentice can deliver that presentation using a format of their choice. And honestly, they're probably likely to use PowerPoint or something similar, but if they wanted to do it using kind of flip charts, diagrams and stuff like that, they can. Okay, so the presentation is then followed by a panel interview, which will last up to 60 minutes. And first and foremost, what the assessor will do in that panel interview is they will ask questions that target any of the assessment criteria that weren't met in the project, okay? And then following that, they'll focus on any of the distinctions. So that's why if the apprentice nails it in the project and they get all of or nearly all of those assessment criteria, that interview is going to be a very comfortable experience where they're going to be then exploring in more detail and really touching on those distinction level exceeded criteria. So there'll always be 12 core questions within the interview, and that's just to make sure it's a consistent experience for the apprentices. Those core questions come from a centralized bank that we give to the assessors, but the assessor will contextualize those questions to kind of match what the apprentice did as part of their project work. So it's not just kind of a very generic question, it will be contextualized. For each of the core questions, the assessor may ask up to 2 follow-up questions. They don't have to, but if the assessor is asking a follow-up question, there's usually 1 or 2 reasons. The first is they don't think that the apprentice quite answered the question fully in their initial response, or indeed they think they've answered it, but they're now pressing them for the distinction. So again, using those mock questions and having practice interviews with the apprentices will really help them in that respect. Mock questions provided in the toolkit. So only the assessor asks any questions, so that the line manager and the coach are kind of observing. However, at the end, there is this 20-minute panel. So the apprentice will be thanked for the time and asked to leave. And then there'll be up to 20-minute discussion between the 3 panel members. And so, like I said earlier, it's the assessor who comes up with that final kind of grading decision. But this is the opportunity if the line manager says, okay, well, they used some acronyms there that you might not have understood, for example, or if they say, okay, they mentioned this other project they were part of, I can give you a bit more context, or yeah, I did observe them when they were dealing with that difficult tenant and, you know, they were really under pressure, and I can confirm that the way they described their reaction is actually accurate and reflects what happened in reality. So the assessor makes the final decision, but that isn't communicated on the day because that will always be subject to our internal IQA process. But the final result will be issued within 5 working days of that interview taking place. So that includes all of the time that we need to kind of quality assure it and everything else. So that was just a very quick kind of whistle stop tour. I think it's fairly kind of straightforward, that assessment method. Just want to talk to you then, there's a timeline on there, which we'll put in the toolkit, just to give you that kind of very clear visual overview of how the EPA process works. But I just wanted to finish on the grading, just to be really clear as to how that's going to work. So the easiest way to think about the grading on the standard is that each of those individual assessment criteria are marked as either met, not met, or exceeded. And that amplification document that we've put in the toolkit makes it really, really clear to the apprentice what they need to do to meet each of those criteria and what they need to do to exceed each of those criteria. And what that also does is it means that our assessors are really clear and really consistent when they're carrying out those assessments. So each of the assessment criteria is graded as met, not met, or exceeded. And in addition to that, each of the competency areas is graded as met, not met, or exceeded. Okay, so the grade for the competency area depends upon the number of assessment criteria that are in that competency area. And that's where it gets a little bit complicated. But we've put together a diagram to kind of try and illustrate that. And I'll just explain that to you now. So in order to get a grade of exceeded for a competency area, you need to hit a certain number of the component assessment criteria at exceeded. So if we start at the top of that, so if within the competency area, there are 5 individual assessment criteria, if the apprentice exceeds 2 of those, they will be awarded a grade of exceeded for that competency area. Okay. If there are only 2 assessment criteria in there, they'll only need to exceed 1 of those assessment criteria to get a grade of exceeded overall. So in order to pass the endpoint assessment overall, the apprentice needs to meet all 59 of the assessment criteria at met. And in order to get a distinction overall, the apprentice needs to get an exceeded score for all 26 of the competencies. So hopefully that makes sense. It is described within the toolkit. If you've got any questions kind of following this, do get in touch with us and we'll be happy to pick up and explain it in a bit more detail to you. Okay, so in terms of resits, the apprentice can resit a maximum of 2 times on each of the assessment methods. And resits and retakes have to be taken within that 6-month EPA window. If the apprentice times out and they get to the end of the 6 months, they have to repeat the whole EPA again. And that's something that's baked into the assessment plan, so that's something that we have to apply. If an apprentice gets a pass for a particular assessment method, they can't resit that in an attempt to uplift it to a distinction. It will be capped at a pass. And we do have reasonable adjustments and special considerations that are available for apprentices that need them. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So we have used up all of the time, but that's good because it means we've got lots of questions. But we've got 10 minutes left now for any additional kind of questions that you might have. So please do fire away.
There's a question in the chat. Can they also do a video presentation?
That's a good question. I hadn't considered that. I think the answer is no. I think it would need to be a live presentation, but I'll check. I mean, from your point of view, Catherine, in the Trailblazer, when you designed that, was the intention it would be live or? Yeah,
it would be a live presentation, but I can see that let's say an apprentice has done a piece of work on improving an estate or redecorating a property that was difficult to let. As part of the presentation, they could embed a short video showing before and after, but I wouldn't expect the presentation to just be, right, press play and I'll sit back as the apprentice. Are the 12 core questions made up of a standard set of KSBs? And the answer,
I think Kayleigh's answered that one below. Yeah, so the 12 core questions will focus on any of the KSBs that weren't met in the project. If indeed they get to the interview and everybody agrees that they have been met, or the assessor determines that they've been met, then the questions will only focus on the distinction criteria. Question from Bev: how long do you think until level 2, level 4 will be ready? I don't want to give a date at the present time. I'll pick up with my team, Bev, and I'll let everybody know who's been on this within the next sort of week or so, an estimated delivery time for those. Sorry, that's a bit of a woolly response. Can apprentices use notes during the interview? Yes. So again, Catherine, as part of the Trailblazer, unless you say no, I think with pretty much all of the EPAs that we do across the 36 standards, the apprentices are permitted to take notes in. The only thing I would say is I have, when we've done our IQA activities and things, sometimes observed interviews where the apprentices are relying too much on their notes and they're not making the eye contact. So absolutely, I would encourage them to take notes in. But same as if you had a job interview, you can absolutely take notes in, but make sure you engage and got the good body language, maintaining eye contact with the assessor and the rest of it. Okay,
I think with the Trailblazer group, there was a sort of, it was, you know, surprising how quickly we've moved on, but we envisaged that an apprentice could, for example, take their portfolio in as hard copy, and it would be there as part of the interview.
Yeah.
But as you say, if somebody was, you know, looking down and reading from their notes,
exactly, yeah,
that wouldn't be acceptable.
Yeah.
But if they just, I don't know, wanted to just double check something, or flick to a page in their portfolio, just to remind themselves of a crucial fact, that would be okay.
Yeah, agreed. So question from Kenny, might be one for you, Catherine. Within the project, are you looking for an implementation of a change in something, or can it be theoretical?
Oh, it is a good question. And I think my answer to that is that if you are happy that the apprentice can demonstrate that full range of knowledge, skills and behaviours through a more theoretical approach, then yes, that's fine. However, there are some things that are almost impossible to do and to demonstrate without actually doing them. For example, that key area of communication with customers and colleagues, you will have to think creatively about how does that become embedded in this project. So it can't just be, for example, a literature review of good practice relating to rough sleepers in an area, or a literature review on the private rented sector in Lincolnshire. You would have to embed within it those key areas of perhaps having some interviews with colleagues, interviews with customers, and embedding that into the research.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, I think we're almost at time, and I think that might be the last of the questions. So just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for attending. Oh, no, one more question. So from Bev, I understand that once the gateway has been submitted, the learner then has 6 months to do the project. How close to that date will the interview take place? So that'll be governed really, I think, by how quickly they can complete the project. So if they go through gateway and if they've kind of already completed it, you know, in say the last few weeks of on program, they start writing up their report. They've written their report and submitted it for assessment. The interview really could take place at any point following that assessment. So in theory, the whole thing can be done and dusted within a few weeks. One of the ways that we work at DSW, when we allocate the assessors, we do that ahead of gateway. So we don't wait until we submit an apprentice through gateway and then start trying to find an assessor. We'll do it kind of a few months in advance. So that means that the assessors kind of have diarised, okay, I know I've got this many apprentices coming through on housing this month. And so they've got the time free in the diary. So from our point of view, we can and we do turn endpoint assessment around very, very quickly. So I think the interview date really is just governed by how quickly the apprentice can move and get their project written up and submitted. I'd be very surprised if it was taking apprentices 6 months to complete the gateway, to be honest. Well, massive thank you again to everyone for attending. Longer session than we normally have with the webinars, but I think that's because there were so many questions and because Catherine had so many insights. So thank you so much, Catherine, for attending. I think that was absolutely invaluable. I'm really glad to have you on our team because you're obviously a real expert in this field. And thanks also to Chelsea and Kayleigh for your support and input today. And we will be sending a recording of this and a copy of the slides very, very soon. And just have a great day, everybody. Thank you.